My comments here, and once again I'm going to record them, so I'm sure that you all are listening to them a second time later on. But in case you need to, it'll be there. We'll just kind of follow along on the speeches through the debate at the beginning, and then we'll kind of go off on tangents concerning particular issues as they come up. Ian, I thought you started pretty effectively. You've got a clear statement on your first point of harms. You've got the three harms that you're talking about: harms to animals themselves, harms to people, and then the argument that says that zoos are not really educational, which isn't so much a harm, but it's kind of a preemptive argument that you're putting in there. It says we're not going to lose anything from the animals. And on the animals themselves at risk, I thought you had a lot of good evidence. You had a nice couple of statistics concerning the birth rates of the animals versus what happens in the wild. You had the information about the elephants that you used a couple of times later on in the debate. And then you've got a good example that I actually have a couple of good examples that illustrate how problematic the zoos are. You know, the painting the animals in the Gaza Zoo, or the sloth bear that ends up dying of malnutrition and starvation because the zookeepers didn't know what was going on. I think those are good examples, and I think that they ought to come up a little bit more in the debate later on. We don't get much reference to them after this. In fact, it's not until the first negative rebuttal that anybody talks about this issue again, and I thought that that was a little bit problematic. I think it ought to come up as a significance claim in the second affirmative also. On the issue of people dying in the zoos, at the end of the debate, for instance, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, I think Ozzy's right. Nobody talked about that issue for a big chunk of time. So you make this argument that says zoos are dangerous places for people. We've got people getting ripped up by tigers. We've got people who have gotten bitten by the pandas. It's just, the wild dogs eat some kid. It's just not, dangerous places here. We don't have any total numbers on that. We don't know how frequently these kinds of things occur. Maybe one of the reasons that these stand out as examples is because they are so unusual and infrequent. But it would be nice that maybe if you had some information that talked about how generalizable that information is. But I thought that you developed those 2 points pretty well. On the educational issue, there's some criticism that's explained in the argument, and that's perfectly fine. The argument that you have kind of at the end of that point is that zoos should not prioritize, money over nature, that kind of thing. And I think that's an interesting value position to be taking in the argument. It doesn't, and that's another one that doesn't really get discussed much in the debate. Nobody ever comes back to us and says this is the case. In fact, I would think, given that Al-Fadi in the first negative argued this whole economic advantage to having zoos there, that should have been the first response to that particular argument that says, look, even if this is true, we're doing this at the expense of animals. We're elevating people above animals. There's something ethically wrong with that, and we see that as being inappropriate. You've already got an argument on the flow based on the first affirmative constructive that answers this issue. And nobody ever makes any reference to it again, except maybe way down at the end of the debate where there's a little bit of discussion of it. So I think that that's a little bit problematic. The inherency argument you present talks about how the zoos don't necessarily have to be accredited. I thought you had a good piece of information here that in the United States, there are only 212 zoos that are accredited out of the 2,400 zoos that exist. So when there's an argument about how zoos are good places, they do the best to maintain the animals, I think that you would be able to come back and say, none of that necessarily applies to all zoos, only the accredited zoos, and we know that there are very few accredited zoos in the United States. That's probably why the sloth bear doesn't get fed, because people there didn't know, because it's not an accredited zoo, that kind of thing. And then you would have a good answer on those particular points. The solvency argument comes up in a couple of other places, so what you presented there is not of critical issue when it comes to explaining an idea or concept. I'm sorry, my timer didn't go off here. And I thought you explained your plan pretty well. We know basically what it is you want to do. There are some things about the plan that I think could become problematic if the negative develop them as issues, but it's well organized. You've got a lot of evidence presented in it. It has all of the component parts to it, so I think you've got a pretty solid affirmative case to start the argument with, and everything like I said, starts the debate pretty swimmingly in that regard. Now, on the negative side, here's the thing that I see as being problematic. Fadi, you have a great set of 3 arguments that you're presenting. Those are all disadvantages. That's generally the second negative's responsibility. It's not a big deal if you're making those arguments and your partner is also going to make an argument about a different issue as it is. But basically, all of the significance that the affirmative is presented, nobody's presenting any answer to. So, are the animals in zoos dying more regularly than they would in the wild? Are people dying in the zoos? Are animals put down less as being less important than money? There's no negative position on those issues until near the end of the debate. Then there's a little bit of argument about that. All right, so I think that's problematic. None of your arguments directly apply to any of the arguments that were presented by the advocate. They're basically 3 different disadvantages. And I thought that you did a good job developing those disadvantages, so let me talk about that first. You label each of the points very clearly. So closing zoos is going to harm the animals in some place. So that's a disadvantage. That's not denying that animals are being harmed in the present system. That's saying if we get rid of the zoos, there's going to be a harm to the animals, which is a different argument than what they're presenting. It's nicely developed, and I do think that you've got some good examples here, especially when we talk about the extinction issue, which I think ultimately is the argument that your partner makes. So he's got a separate disadvantage that is based on an argument that's contained in this first point. But I thought that you talked about how animals in zoos are more likely to thrive, they get better care, we address those kinds of issues. I think that those are pretty good points. Now, your argument about affecting education, that does apply to the third point that they presented. None of your argument responds directly to their point. It's just like I've got a separate rebuttal argument on that issue. So there's no refutation of the grounds of the warrant that the advocate presented. There's only a rebuttal counterclaim on this particular point. And I thought it was developed pretty well as a counterclaim. You had some information about how the kids learn from the stuff in the zoo, what the educational roles are, how it's supposed to inspire them, how they know a little bit more about the behavior of animals, that kind of thing. I think that those are good arguments. Like I said, I'm just not sure why you didn't apply them to that argument directly. You just kind of contained them in their own separate structure. But again, lots of good evidence on those points. One of the things that I think is very noticeable in this debate is the quality of research is pretty solid. You've got a good start on what kind of information you need to build the arguments. Now, I might have some questions about some of the sources that are being used. They sound maybe a little bit iffy. I think there are a couple of affirmative sources that's like, I don't know, some organization that, the IHateZoos.com or something like that. And I'm going, who are these people, and why should we be trusting them? But other than that, guys, everybody was very good about citing sources for the most part. Once in a while, somebody would forget to cite a source. They'd say, well, some scientist said, and they forgot to tell us who that particular person was. But I would say 90% of the time, everybody was doing a good job in citing the evidence there, and that would include you in the first negative constructive. The disadvantage about harming the economy, like I said, that's clearly a disadvantage. It's got nothing to do with the argument that the advocates presented, except indirectly to the position that they're taking on this. Animals shouldn't be, made to serve mana. They should be valued for nature. Like I said, you don't really have a response to that. Your argument is, there is an economic value to them. Look at what they do. They create all kinds of jobs. And I thought you did, to me, this is maybe one of the better disadvantages that I've heard in a debate in a long time. It's not super well organized internally, where I don't get a clear supporting structure, but you mentioned it's going to harm the economy, and it's not just it's going to hurt zoos and people be unemployed. I get a lot of people who present disadvantages, and that's all they say. Well, you've got an estimate about the number of zoos that there are, the number of people who work in the zoos, the amount of money that zoos generate in terms of income, the amount of money that they generate in surrounding areas, the impact that it has in a particular example. You've got a lot of information here about the economic impact of zoos in the world. And I'm going, those are all damn good arguments. There's a lot of information here that supports that point. So I think that that's a good response there. I mean, it's not a response. I think it's a good disadvantage. Like I said, traditionally, the second negative would be arguing the disadvantages. But since he's not arguing that same issue, he's got a whole different argument that he's developing. There's nothing wrong with your arguing a disadvantage. But I do think that you miss an opportunity to respond to some of their claims, which means that later on they're going to be able to get away with some stuff. They're going to be able... Like we said, Lazi said it at the end. Hey, what about all the dead people that we mentioned? They never talked about that. We've got, dead teenagers and dead kids and a father ripped apart in front of his family at the zoo. And what does the negative say about this? Well, I don't know. Let me see. Nothing. So we've got this significance claim that we presented at the very beginning that the negative never talked about. And that's one of the problems when you go off and create your own structure. There might be good arguments in that structure, but you have a burden of rebuttal, remember? And your failure to answer an argument that's presented by the other side, I think, suddenly kind of gives them carte blanche to say, then our argument should be accepted in this situation. And I think that becomes a problem. Okay, so that's the first negative constructive. The second affirmative constructive. Ozzy, you start off kind of giving us some general information about zoos and how they work and how they're not really educational. And that information I think is useful. And you've got this kind of philosophical argument about, well, how'd you like to be stuck in a dollhouse for all of your life and that kind of thing. And there's a value argument to be made here. I think you might want to save it and apply it to the value argument that Ian presented in the first affirmative, which is this whole thing that animals are being made to serve man and that we've got our priorities wrong on this issue. And then it would make a little bit more sense. As it is, it feels like it's a kind of a separate significance argument, a different value claim, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does seem to come a little bit out of left field. In your constructive, there was almost no response to the points that the negative presented on the disadvantages. There's a little bit on some of the stuff on the first point. I mean, you kind of challenge the argument about extinction, and you talk about, I don't know why the dinosaurs came up as an example at all, because 65 million years. Well before human beings are around, no dinosaurs. So it's like, how does this apply to the zoo argument? I wasn't quite clear. But the idea is that animals are going to become extinct, and the negative presented a couple of examples, and your response basically is that we'll learn about these animals through technology, and sometimes that's the way it goes. I'm not exactly sure that that's the right response here, and later on, I think, Ian, you do the same kind of thing. It's like, hey, maybe just the white lions were designed to disappear. We should be done with them. Nature selected them to disappear. You sound like Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. Nature chose them to disappear. By the way, one of the things that you guys should be pointing out is that contradicts their position. One of their positions. If humans aren't supposed to take precedence over animals, well, why is it the animals are disappearing in the wild? You've said it. Because we're screwing up the climate. We're polluting the earth. We're doing all these things that are destroying their habitats. So it is human beings who are causing this problem. And how are we trying to address that issue? We're trying to address it by ensuring that animals that are threatened are kept alive in some way, shape, or form. ultimately reproducing them in some way. That's what the whole, Giovanni's whole second negative argument is about, is the conservation effort and trying to maybe make these animals survive at some particular point. Plus, the ones that can't survive in any other place, at least we've got a place to have them and they'll continue to exist. And later on, their only argument is, well, let nature choose. First of all, it's not necessarily nature. Mankind is screwing a lot of this stuff up. It's not that the white tigers all got eaten by some other tiger, or lion, and that's nature selecting that. It's that human beings hunted them to extinction. We encroached on their environment. So I think you've got a value argument that you could be making also. And I think, Giovanni, when we get to your argument, I think you get a little bit more out of that by arguing that that we have a moral justification for doing this. It's not just that having those animals is good for biodiversity, which is kind of an argument that you make that doesn't get developed very much, but that there's this moral imperative that would then answer their other significance claim. I think that would be a good way about going about that. All right. Ozzie, your partner made a whole bunch of arguments about the animals in zoos not living very long, and you don't really extend those arguments. I think I'd point out right away that said, what did the negatives say about our arguments concerning the death of animals in zoos? They didn't say anything. You should point that out. What did they say about people dying in zoos? You make that argument, but you don't make that argument until the last affirmative rebuttal. This would be one of those places they reemphasize, and you could easily say, look, we've documented at least a half dozen cases where this is true. There are probably hundreds more where people have been injured or died or gotten some disease or something bad has happened to them at a zoo that we haven't mentioned, and that would be a good place to maybe have an extension argument and maybe have some additional information. And the negative has said nothing about this so far. My partner's argument hasn't been refuted. Here's some additional evidence to prove that particular point. And then when this issue comes up at the end of the debate, it's not like it's let me grab something that existed, 5-6 speeches ago. This is something that we've argued about consistently throughout the debate. And I think that would be a good way to deal with it. Now, on the economic argument, you do respond to that argument. But your response here is a little bit like, well, that doesn't mean that there won't ever be any jobs, and maybe people will get new jobs. That's kind of a weak response, I think, for, if we were going to continue this discussion, well, that's probably true of anybody who loses their job. Well, you'll get another job. But you'll be unemployed for a period of time. You may have to change what you're doing. It may not pay as much. And by the way, there's a lot of stress that comes from losing a job that is not necessarily good for human beings. That would be, I think, the response that you guys would want to make when he makes this argument. But that's the only argument that he's got on this jobs issue. So to me, I think later on, you guys miss an opportunity to really pound that argument and make it more successful given the lightweight response that they have on that particular argument. All right. Now, you do come back to the one argument about the animals and their being problematic, because you talk about the elephants being isolated and that sort of thing. So that does come up. And here's the problem with some of this is nothing's very well organized in your presentation. So I do think you have arguments on some of the issues that your partner presented, but it's not very well organized. I do think you have a couple of responses that apply to that first argument, but it seems like it's a little bit randomized and it's never directed at, I won't say never, because you did have one thing about the species, argument that you talked about, but that was the one place where it was pretty direct. Everything else, it's like I'm having to kind of guess where things are supposed to go, and you should be telling me where they go so that they're better organized. But same as we were saying before, I thought that there was good evidence in some of your arguments. I thought that you had some interesting ideas. You did a good job trying to continue the position that you're taking in the constructive. And you have this argument later on that I thought was kind of interesting, how the zoos are not doing a good job taking care of their animals. They're feeding them roadkill. You do have an answer when they talk about how the animals are well cared for. You say, well, do we really want the animals all drugged up all the time? I'm not exactly sure that that's what their argument was, that they're treating the depression of the tigers by giving them, little Zoloft for the, feline Zoloft or something like that. That's not really the argument that they're making. They're making the argument that if they get sick, they get treatment in a zoo. If they get sick in the wild, they're screwed. Maybe they'll live, maybe they won't. Maybe they suddenly become somebody's prey because they can't fight back. And that's kind of their argument about why the zoos are going to be beneficial in the long run. All right, Giovanni, I can pick out claims in your argument, and there's a lot of good evidence, like I said before. And to me, everything that you said looks like it's one big disadvantage. And that's the argument that says if we get rid of zoos, we're not going to have the conservation efforts that we need to have in order to preserve these animals. And I thought everything that you presented on this was really solid, explaining that whole process, explaining how it works, why we need the complexity of this. I think there's a good argument later on when they talk about how nature works and all that kind of stuff. You say, look, you can't just release the animals back into nature. When they reintroduce these animals, they have to look at a variety of factors, what their survivability would be, their ability to flourish under the circumstances in which they've been released, which ones are most likely to be successful. And zoos are necessary to make those kinds of decisions. They just say, dump them back into nature, and we'll hope for the best, and Darwinism will take over. And I think you guys have a good position that says, we do this, these animals are going to disappear. We know we've had examples of animals that almost disappeared in the past that zoos have brought back, and you guys mentioned the condor and the black-footed ferret comes up a couple of times, and I guess it's the golden frog. Is it a frog?
It was a frog.
Okay, yeah, the amphibian, whatever it is, that kind of stuff, and say, look, these would just disappear if the zoos were not there preserving them. And it's important to keep those animals. So I think you've got a good argument here. I think it could be better organized. But all of the evidence applies, and all of your argument, it's all about that same issue. It's not a repeat of an argument that your partner presented, so I got the feeling that you divided up the responsibilities reasonably well. There's a little bit of conservation argument that he presents, but he leaves most of that to you in the argument, and you developed it really well. So I think you're in good shape on that argument. So those are the constructive speeches. I think everybody's doing something good in the constructive speeches, but they're not always doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, and they're not always well organized. Like I said, they're kind of organized a little bit differently. If you had his organization for your disadvantage, I think it would have been a stronger disadvantage. And if you'd responded to their points a little bit more directly, I think that would have given your other arguments a little bit more context for comparative purposes. I think the case structure starts off really well. The follow-up is pretty good, but there are some things that you miss, partially because the arguments that are presented in the first negative are disadvantage arguments rather than arguments on the significance, inherency, and solvency issues. So that just got a little confusing. All right, now, when we get to the rebuttals, Al-Fadi, this is where you suddenly start applying arguments to the affirmative case. So it's like that case has existed. It was the first thing that was presented. Then you spoke and didn't say anything about it. Ozzie talked about it. He barely said anything about it. We got another speech about something else. And then finally, somebody else is going to be talking about the affirmative case. So you got a couple of responses here that talk about zoos, try to address these animals being sick. You've got the argument about longevity that you're presenting on that particular point. And I'm going, yeah, but why did you wait until this point to make those arguments? That should have been something that could have been in the first affirmative. And maybe you could have given one of your disadvantages to Giovanni to run, and you could have argued these things earlier on, so we had a little conflict on those issues at that particular point. The zoos being educational, for instance, well, you did have the second argument that you presented on that issue. It was indirectly applied to this, but now you've got some other arguments on that point that you extended. I thought that was pretty well. I do think that you need to synthesize a little bit. So what is the point that we're saying here from the negative position? In the long run, what is it we're trying to do? We're trying, and that's where it needs to be a little bit clearer, because we're focusing when you get to the rebuttals. You're trying to figure out, here's the point of the arguments that we've made and why our position is the valid one. zoos are doing the work that we need to do to preserve animals. One of the ways that they do that is by allowing people to see the animals, and they provide extra benefits too, like employing a lot of people. If we were to get rid of zoos, we're going to have problems with that. That's basically the argument that the negative side is presenting. So what are the arguments that you had that best illustrate those points? That's what you should be emphasizing at the end, kind of remind us of that particular position. I thought some of your arguments were a little hit or miss on that, but you did a pretty good job. And one thing that you did do, for instance, is on the economic argument, you extended that argument, and you had a good, I think you want to point out that they didn't have a very good answer to it. But your extension is they have more than a $5 billion impact on the economy. And actually, your original evidence said they had a $16 billion impact. So your extension argument's a little bit smaller than the original argument. I don't know that you want to reduce it for anything that they're talking about. I think you should go back to the original argument and said, so they've never said anything about this. There's $16 billion in economic advantage that comes from this, a whole bunch in wages, a whole bunch in jobs, and they don't talk about any of this except in the most generic way. They say, well, animals shouldn't be made to serve humans in this particular way. By the way, had you answered that argument earlier, you could say, everybody loves animals, everybody wants to keep them, but the truth of the matter is, human beings, top of the pyramid here, and we have uses and needs that that we're part of the process. One of the advantages of being the top dog is that we get to make a lot of decisions. They're not complaining about us eating animals. We do that, Animals do serve human purposes for a variety of reasons. We use animals in work. We milk cows. We have horses that do work. They mentioned the elephants laboring in different parts of the world. They don't have a complaint about that. So why it is that putting animals in a zoo that human beings could see, but also allows, also benefits the animals in the long run, I'm not sure that we are really saying human beings don't care about animals. We're saying we can all get something out of this together, and then your argument, I think, is even stronger. Because I didn't think their responses to that point were particularly good. All right, and you need to be selling that point. All right. All right, Ian, in the first affirmative rebuttal, I think you got a couple of good arguments, but you've got a bad persuasive argument that you're making, and it comes down to, hey, sink or swim, animals. Maybe we don't need the black-footed ferret. Who gives a damn about the white tiger or white lions? Let nature choose. And I'm going, well, first of all, almost all of that argument is asserted. That's the way it's going to go, and I think the negative is given some good reasons why we need to conserve these animals, and I think you could give even stronger reasons why it's important, kind of from a philosophical position, but it also kind of contradicts your position in a sense that says, where human beings are disrespecting animals. Well, you think animals are any more respectful of each other than they are? And by the way, disrespecting animals, you put them back in the wild, guess how human beings are disrespecting them there? That's the argument that you made originally, and everybody's been talking about. It's kind of in the background that animals are disappearing in nature because of climate change, because of pollution, and all those arguments. And this is our responsibility. We need to do something about that. So I think that general response, I can kind of understand, well, that's a quick, simple way of answering things, but I don't think a lot of people are going to be persuaded by that. I think a lot of people are going to look at it and go, really? That's what we want to do? That's a little bit iffy. So I think that's a bit problematic. I did think that in the on the case issues, you had a couple of good arguments. For example, you extended the longevity argument, and you say, look, they die only 30% last in the zoos when they're born, the 40% in the wild. They got a better birth rate in the wild than they have in zoos. We ought to be thinking about that for the animals. And by the way, that might apply to the conservation argument. That, I think, is an argument that you could say, well, if we're talking about conserving animals and reintroducing them in the wild, where do they have a better chance of reproducing? In the wild. 40% versus 30%, or whatever the number was, something like that. That could be an application that you're making there. I did appreciate the fact that you brought back up the issue that hadn't been talked about by the negative of the people being killed. We got this 17-year-old, when you say talk about, you kind of apply it to the education issue. Here's how kids are being educated. They're learning that they shouldn't get drunk and throw things at the tigers. Which is a smart-ass response, but I appreciated it. I thought it worked. I'm a smart-ass. I like that response. So it works pretty well. But it also brings up that issue again about, look, people are dying in the zoos. There's a problem here that we ought to be addressing. Now, we get to the second negative rebuttal, and I got to go to this. This is the very first time that the negative makes an inherency argument. We've got the American Zoo and Aquarium Association that has codes of conduct, and we have federal regulations that regulate these things to protect the animals. I'm going, that would have been a nice argument to make earlier that would have applied to the arguments that they're presenting in their case. Why am I getting them in the last negative speech in the debate? We've had 3 negative speeches up to this point, and here's the first time anybody's addressing that issue. I think it's a good argument that comes too late to do you any good. That should have been an argument in the first negative constructive, because that's an inherency argument. In the present system, we have things that would limit this, control this, change this. You could argue a minor repair that says all the zoos that are out there, in order to get any benefit from the city to maintain their tax-exempt status or anything, they ultimately are going to have to comply with AZA accreditation. And then that'll fix some of the problems that the negative or the affirmative is talking about without getting rid of the zoos. We just need to make these accreditations more widely available, assist the zoos in coming up with it. If the zoos have zookeepers that are not well educated, then the solution to this problem is not take the animals out of the zoo. The solution is let's get better educated zookeepers in there. And that's an easy argument to make. And like I said, you barely make that argument, and it's coming very late in the process. So I think that's kind of an odd strategy. On the other hand, I did think that you did a good job arguing why it's problematic to release the animals instead of trying to rely on the conservation thing. I think you could have gotten more out of your conservation arguments. I think you should be coming back to say, you can't just release the animals because not all of them will survive. We have specific animals that we know have to be kept in zoos or else they're going to disappear. And we have new things that are going on in the environment that are problematic for animals that we can't fix. So if we want to preserve the animals, we have to keep them in the zoos. All right, it's not nature that's wiping them out. It's those things again, climate change and human intervention and change of the non-native species. And I think you had like the fungus or something that you're talking about at one point that they come in contact with these weird spores or something along that line that they didn't exist where they were before, and now suddenly they're going to be exposed to that. That's going to wipe them out. I think you made good arguments on those, and they didn't respond to that extensively, and so you should always come back and remind people, here's the argument that I made, here's what I said was going to happen, and their answer doesn't address that issue very well. All right. And then there are a few extensions on the education issue. I did like that the kids felt a little bit more educated, and there was some stuff that talked about how the zoos work. I think that you want to remind people that your partner made a couple of arguments that didn't get answered very well. The unemployment issue, for instance, and the economic impact of zoos. Because remember, your job in the second negative rebuttal is to kind of summarize the argument for both you and your partner in the debate. So I thought that some of those issues got a little bit less attention than they might have otherwise. And Ozzy, I think that you did a nice job at the end coming back, reminding us of that issue that was up there earlier. Hey, how about all the people that are dying? The negative never said anything about those. I think that that's a good significance pull to be making. It would have been stronger had you talked about it earlier, but I think that that's a good significance pull. Plus, Ian did say something about it in the first the first affirmative rebuttal. So you've got that going for you. I think you guys are a little sketchy on the conservation issue. I think you need better arguments on the conservation issue there. The value argument, I think, would give you a little bit more credibility at the end if it had been argued at any point between the first speech and the last speech. As it is, there's nothing there until we get back to that particular point. And I think that would have been, for example, a good response since the first negative made the argument about the economic argument, then that should have been a response that you made in the second affirmative constructive. But at the end, we got a little bit of summary. And then there are just some random things that come up. The roadkill issue comes back. They never said anything about it, and here we are talking about it again. I don't know why it's important. And then at the end, I thought you talked about a few other things that are potentially problematic about the zoos themselves. But again, I think it needed to be organized a little bit more. It felt a little bit random there. All right, I've rambled on for quite a while. I know everybody's anxious to go. They said, God, does he ever shut up? Yes, he does, but
Did you ever work in the house?
Filibusters? Yeah, I should. But
What?
you guys worked. Look, you guys worked really hard, I think, to try and get into shape. And I want you to get as much feedback as you can, which is why I have everybody doing evaluations. So you're going to get more feedback there. I give you this oral evaluation. You're going to get a written evaluation too, but there's a lot of effort in this, and this is a big part of your grade. This is half your grade are the two debates. So if you don't get them right, that's going to be a problem. All right. Questions? Yes, sir.